Okay. Good afternoon to everybody. My name is Vishwas Satka. I'm the principal investigator for Emancipatory Future Studies in the Anthropocene. It's a new knowledge project at Wits University. It's attempting to break with the mold of future studies, which is largely taught in business schools and so on, and kind of abstracts from trends and things like that, but rather trying to ground our thinking in inter and transdisciplinary knowledge. There are various thrusts in the Emancipatory Future Studies project, thinking about climate temporalities and futures, thinking about systemic pathways into the future, thinking about decolonizing futures, which is what we're going to be talking about today. We cannot be talking about decolonized futures with theory that is seeped in Eurocentric assumptions and thrusts. We also have a kind of thrust around grand ecocentric futures and so on. But the underlying idea of emancipatory future studies is that the subaltern can think, that movements at the front lines of transformation, of struggle in the world and in our society have answers. They have visions, they have anticipatory modes of thinking and so on. So this is what emancipatory future studies is all about. Today, we are very privileged to have with us Aditya Nigam. Aditya has actually been a friend for over 2.5 decades, actually. When I visited India, 2.5 decades ago, I went in search of interesting intellectuals and I found him. And since then, over 2.5 decades, we've had conversations whenever we've interacted in India, in South Africa, on different questions, on Marxism, on postmodernism, on democracy, on politics, on alternatives. And so it's been a very, very exciting journey. And it's really, really wonderful to have Aditya on this platform. Professor Aditya Nigam is a political theorist based at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. His recent work has been concerned with the decolonization of social and political theory. He has previously worked on ideological and discursive formations and their relationship to the constitution of political subjectivities. In particular, his interest lies in theorizing the contemporary experience of politics, populism, and democracy in the non-West, treating the non-West as the ground for doing theory rather than a field for application or testing of standard frameworks derived from the Western experience. A parallel and related part of Nigam's work has been concerned with interrogating the received philosophical history of capital, once again from the vantage point of the experiences of India and the non-West in general. Aditya Nigam also works with the CSDS's Indian Languages Program and its Hindi journal, Pratiman. He comments regularly on contemporary political issues on the blog kafila.online. He's the author of The Insurrection of Little Selves, The Crisis of Secular Nationalism in India, Power and Contestation, India since 1989 with Nivedita Menon, After Utopia, Modernity, Socialism, and the Post-Colony, and Desire Named Development, and more recently, Decolonizing Theory, Thinking Across Traditions. And I think it's this last intellectual installment that has really, if you like, prompted me to invite Aditya to this platform. As many know, decolonization, epistemological decolonization is very much part of the agenda in the South African academic space and the political space, from Rose Must Fall to Fees Must Fall, and to a kind of yearning more generally in society for a new way of grappling with knowledge. And so it's in this context, Aditya's lecture today, Decolonizing Theory, is absolutely important. Aditya, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you to give us this talk for about 20, 25 minutes. I'll flag you as we get closer to the end. Over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thank you, Vish, for that nostalgia-inducing initial remarks. I also recall the period from around 95, 96, quite an interesting time when we were all kind of shipwrecked after the collapse of the socialist world, found ourselves in an island where no one knew where to go. So that was actually where we started. Anyway, much of the work that I've been doing since, and much of the thinking that has gone into the making of this book actually starts from there. So I will not go into, without wasting any time, not going into the history of all that and so on, just focus on 6 points briefly, with the purpose of just flagging the main questions that I raise in my last book, The Decolonising Theory, and around which I think some kind of thinking, fresh thinking has been possible. I mean, what I have tried to do in the book is obviously not something coming out of nowhere. It is all coming out of a certain body of work that has already emerged. Unfortunately, what happens is that what has emerged through the work of historians and anthropologists remains actually ghettoized in departments which are area studies departments or in specific so area studies in when I'm saying area studies, it's probably it's things like the US Academy and so on. But otherwise, we are doing our work in different parts of the South, or what used to be called the Third World. But that never really comes to the point of even touching the surface of what is known as theory. So part of the enterprise here is to actually bring all that to speak back to theory in a way, to treat the field itself as not a passive recipient of theories where frameworks derived from a particular experience, that of Europe in the 19th century, will be applied or can be applied. And either proved or if not proved, we can say that, well, there are some kinds of modifications and so on that we need to make. But by and large, theory remained unperturbed by whatever was happening in the rest of the world. Whereas, and this is my point of departure, but before that, let me just briefly say one thing. This is not something I'm going to spend too much time on, but coming from India, this is very important. It may also be important in the African context. I won't put my neck out on that. But certainly in the Indian context, there is a sense which has been there from roughly, let us say, the early 20th century, that rejection of colonial knowledge, these categories may not have existed in this form, but rejection of colonial knowledge implies a turn towards some kind of nativism, indigenism, and so on, a return to the source, to the pre-colonial source. Of course, in our case, it becomes even more context because the pre-colonial was at least about 100 to 900, 800 to 900 years of what is called quote-unquote Muslim, which includes the Turks and the Afghans and so on and so forth now, and the Mughals. So for us then, this return to the source actually became a return to some really hoary past, that of the Vedic civilization. And as it happened, early 20th century was the time when the Indus Valley civilization was being basically dug out, and it was being realized. It was realized by the work done by the archaeologists. The first round actually appeared while digging the railways, digging for the railways. But anyway, eventually entire cities were discovered. And that sent the imagination of the Hindu intelligentsia spiraling here looked like we were the people who taught the whole world. We had a civilization before anyone else had, and so on. So I want to steer clear of that for the simple reason that we have seen from our own experience that that is a blind alley. There is actually no way in which you can access pure, unsullied pre-colonial past, or not just pre-colonial past, but that hoary indigenous native past, which is fixated on the source, so to speak, which is the Vedic times. That is impossible for two reasons. One, a lot has happened since then, and our understanding of what was, or even what the Indus Valley civilization was, is not something that has come in any manner of continuity. There is no continuity. Some Sanskrit, traditional Sanskrit scholars will claim continuity, but that is all continuity of oral transmission. The tradition of writing down texts was mainly found in traditional India among Buddhists, not among the Hindus. And so when I say Hindus, I mean what we today understand by Hindus who trace their history back to the Vedic corpus. So there is no continuity. And because there is no continuity, there is also a huge reliance, that is the second reason, a huge reliance ultimately to the work done by the colonialists and the Orientalists, to the colonial officials who set about producing knowledge about India with the help of, at that time, the available Brahmins, Pandits who actually interpreted tradition in the way that they wanted. Now, my sense from reading whatever I've read in Africa is also that here too, custom, chiefdom, and so on, kingship, all these things are not really traditional or customary. A lot of it was actually reinvented during colonial times. So that is why I want to shun that way. That is not going to be lead. That doesn't lead us anywhere. So what do I mean by decolonizing? And why do we need decolonizing? My point is very simple, that if we look at our paraphernalia of social sciences, if we ask anybody who has been trained in our modern social sciences, which is obviously social sciences derived from a certain Western experience, then all of us must have experienced, I have experienced it, and I'm sure everybody present here would have experienced that whenever you ask any question about your society, whether it is about its intellectual traditions, whether it is about its modernity, whether it is about its democratic system, whether it is about its secularism, in everything our answer is one. Simple answer, that we are not yet modern. We haven't yet reached there. We haven't yet become secular. We haven't yet become democratic. So we are always in what Vish Chakravarti, very classic phrase, by now it's a classic phrase, called we're perpetually in the waiting room of history. Our train has yet to come, is yet to come. And therefore, my point here is that we need to look, and this is because the lecture is also the Emancipatory Futures Studies lecture. I think it's important for me to make this point here that this is not just about the past. It is about our future. That what we do today, the way we understand and analyze our contemporary opens up possibilities for the future in tandem with it, in keeping with that. And so that is an important consideration always, that we are not looking here at simply singing glories about a lost and glorious civilization of whatever kind. So that's the thing. Now, second point that I want to make very quickly before I go into the three substantive or four substantive questions, 3+1. And this question has to do with the problem of modernity. Everything actually begins with that, because in a way it marks, as we all understand and recognize by now, it marks a fundamental radical rupture with the past that existed before that. Now, the past can be very different in different societies, but in a certain sense, in a manner of speaking, what social science gives us, or what Western philosophy gives us, is one past which is maybe diverse in its actual manifestations, in its empirical manifestations. But like true Hegelians, modernity actually, in that sense, is quite an embodiment of that Hegelian idea, which remains completely unperturbed by that difference, because ultimately, well, it is actually also quite it resonates also with a certain kind of Advaitic philosophy here, the Vedantic philosophy here, where all the diversity and the plurality that exists in the world is ultimately put down to the one, the Brahma, the source. And in a sense, that is what happens with modernity, that all our pasts are kind of relegated to the Dark Middle Ages. Dark Middle Ages was a very European experience. It was the experience of Latin Christendom, when the entire Latin Christendom was under the thrall of the church and its inquisitions and its crusades and so on and so forth. But it was as if the light of the Enlightenment shone forth, started shining forth on the rest of the world, illuminating the rest of the world, which was till then lying in darkness, so to speak. So this is one thing on which, if you actually look at the amount of work which already exists and has existed and was recognized by the Renaissance. The Renaissance starts in Italy, which is actually in the Mediterranean, just bordering the areas which were not just bordering Athens, it's actually bordering that universe which was classical, which was the classical world, where from Athens to Sicily, to Asia Minor, to Egypt, to Alexandria, all this formed part of a common universe, a common intellectual universe. It was not Athens, and what became Greece did not actually was not part of Europe. So the Renaissance had no problem in that sense, in often acknowledging the rationalist traditions of Ibn Rushd, for example. And the early 13th century, 14th century universities in Europe were drawing very, in a very big way, from the tradition of Arab philosophers, whom we now condescendingly call Aristotelian philosophers. 15 centuries after Aristotle, they are not Aristotelian. They were actually doing something with their philosophy. Aristotle was part of their universe. Aristotle was not part of some Europe from which they were drawing. That was the universe that they considered their part of their history. Anyway, that stopped in a way. The Enlightenment breaks in a certain sense and completely evacuates or expunges, or if one may use the term that Laura Marx has used in the context of philosophy, does an ethnic cleansing of philosophy, so that you don't even have the memory of what all philosophical traditions were sourced in the production of the further philosophical developments during the Enlightenment. Similarly, scientific traditions throughout the Arab world We know of astronomy, we know of the work done by the Maraga school and the work that inspired or with actually the equations and analysis with which Copernicus worked, or the science and technology from China and so on. So I will not detail all that here, but that was another part of the world where Arab world, China, so many other parts of the world, even India during the medieval period was not lying in darkness. Enough Indian history exists, very serious work done over the decades, which shows that actually this is not a dark, not the dark ages of by any stretch of imagination. So we have got used to this idea that before the West came along, we were all living in superstition. We had no rationalism, we had no secularism, we had nothing. And the reverse thing that happened with many nationalists was to start claiming that we had everything before we came. That is also not correct. Because I think, for example, there are a lot of claims being made by a lot of people through the 20th century about how India had great democratic traditions and so on and so forth. Well, they had some kind of deliberative traditions. They had some kind of way in which the ruler in the small context of the Ganas, the republics, what were later called the republics, were elected, supposed to have been elected, but that doesn't make it a democracy. And the way in, so that's why I want to separate out that. I don't have the time to go into all that detail. But what I do want to underline here is that that rupture which came with the Enlightenment has produced that kind of past from where we actually have stopped looking at our own histories in that when it comes to doing theory. It's not like historians are not doing it. It's not like our anthropologists have no sense of the range of things that exhibited during the course of our actual practice of politics and our social life and so on. So I'll take 3 instances which I have taken in the book and quickly run through them. I think Vishwas will flag me at 20, so I should know. But I want to say, take for example the one of the chapters which I call the theorizing the political, Mandala and the social polity. Now, Mandala is a very Sanskrit term, and it refers to a particular cosmology. But Stanley Tambaya, a Sri Lankan anthropologist, used the concept of the mandala to describe what he called the galactic polity. Now, this is a polity which is actually the idea of sovereignty is completely foreign. There is no one single ruler who is deputed by the king and by God and so on. In the kind of highly fused monotheistic states of Europe. What we have rather is a string of small kingdoms around, let us say, one big, slightly bigger kingdom, and these form together a galaxy. So Tambaya calls it the galactic polity, but many contemporary researchers have seen, from Clifford Geertz to James Scott working on the hills on the northeastern side of India and down to Burma and so on, that from there to Indonesia, Malaysia, that in large parts of Southeast Asia, you find what are called these small states, which are or little kingdoms, which display a kind of dispersed fossil power. And in fact, what is known in classical or traditional Hindu scholarship and writings and political theory kind of writings as the Saptang tradition or Saptang notion of the state of political power. That is 7 constituents of political power. One of those is Maitri, which is the ally. So there are the other 6 components include the fortress, the treasury, the army, and so on. But there is one which is the ally. Now, this ally is supposed to be internal to or part of the idea of the Saptang, which is only possible or only makes sense within a mandala kind of formation. And now, the interesting thing is when modern Indian historians or early the Indian historians discussing, let's say, early medieval to modern period, invariably come up against this idea of dispersed, what they call the dispersed foci of power. There's a lot of internal debate among them about how to interpret it, but there is no disagreement that this is the case. Much of the terminology for that initially comes from the African studies, because a lot of work on Africa talks about segmentary state. That the state in many of these African societies was also not the unitary state that you see in the Western context, in the European context in particular. When I say Western, let's by and large, it refers to Europe. Now, there is therefore a way in which this larger universe, whether it is across Africa, whether it is in South and Southeast Asia, actually China's that way probably more centralized, but not in the sense in which we understand it again in the European context. So we have actually a whole range of different formations. But what happens when we start thinking of or talking about political theory, the same framework of sovereignty, of rights, and so on, the same theories that we have learned from actually a theorization of the Western experience is what we start teaching in our school textbooks and college textbooks and university textbooks here. That is the kind of research, when we start doing research, that is the paraphernalia with which we start doing our research. So that is one kind of thing. The second thing which I want to discuss, I'm just flagging these, we can take them up in discussion. The second thing that I want to discuss here is what I have called the Quranic. The Quranic as a space of encounter, the Quranic as a mode of being. Now, Quranic in the Indian context actually means there are within Hinduism broadly 2 kinds of texts: the Vedas and the Puranas. The Vedas are the classical Sanskrit texts which are written by and for the Brahmins. The Puranic texts are actually texts which have a lot of stories which you may find in the Vedas also, or in Vedic literature. But a lot of this Puranic stuff is addressed to a different audience. It is addressed to the non-Vedic people, to the so-called darker, the Aborigines, the lower castes, who were not yet incorporated into the caste order, and so on and so forth. So the sense in which I use the Puranic here is as the space of encounter between this high Vedic and the broadly subaltern of that time populations. Now, that again has a resonance with what we see all across. This is the Quranic does not address religion in the sense in which we understand it, again through the lens of, let us say, the Abrahamic religions, Christianity or Judaism, Islam, and so on, because these have more to do with what is sometimes called as natural religion of the Aborigines or of the indigenous people. So spirits, magic, ancestors, these are part of our everyday existence. Jinns, It's not just Hindus. A lot of contemporary life exhibits, so you will exhibit this kind of a tendency, whether it is among Hindus or Muslims, doesn't matter. And a lot of our Muslims in Delhi still kind of have these jinn figures, the benign jinn figures. So anyway, I will conclude. I am leaving out the capital, non-capital bit because that I have discussed at length elsewhere. We can come back to it in our discussion, but I want to now conclude. I have 2 minutes left. I want to conclude with just one other point, which is that drawing all these strands together, my discussion of capital, or the discussion on secularism and the Quranic, and the discussion of the political, is that in theoretical and philosophical terms, it presents before us one big question, which is the question of the totality and the outside. In a way, we have all learned to understand through Western philosophy and through Western social sciences, the theory that is operative in Western social sciences, that there is no outside to modernity, there is no outside to capitalism. Everything is like one big system. And once modernity is in place, everything is always already modern, and so on. So that leaves actually no space for us to conceptualize the existences, the being of the non-West or the pre-modern. I'm now using the term pre-modern and pre-capitalist also in a way which is to say that they come with longer histories. They are not coterminous with or not coeval with modernity and capitalism. Therefore, pre. But it doesn't mean that they are there for the past. When we talk of pre-capitalism, in a certain sense, we say, oh, these are just past forms. These are forms that are now consigned to the past. They are to be eliminated. They will die out, or if not die out, state policy must eliminate it. That is where actually the futures part comes in, because that is what all our post-colonial states are actually doing. They are trying to destroy agriculture. They're trying to destroy indigenous life. They're trying to destroy everything that was supposed to be pre. The sense in which I want to underline that there is a need to retain the term pre, retain the prefix pre for certain kinds of practices, certain kinds of life forms, modes of being, is precisely to underline that they, even though they continue to exist today, they have a longer history which goes much further back beyond capitalism and modernity. And the story that modernity and European philosophy tells us, that once modernity is in place or capitalism is in place, we have no way but to think of all these as to kind of one chapter in which I deal with Zizek. I'm quoting his phrase, so that these are retroactively posited by capital or by modernity. So all of us are retroactively posited by Europe. We actually have no being of our own. In a very strange way, what Marx said, the anatomy of man is key to the anatomy of the ape, becomes a kind of justification in a strange way of saying that the higher form has ultimately all the epistemic privilege of telling the lower forms, or not just epistemic privilege, actually eventually it becomes an ontological privilege, because it is the higher form that it in fact decides what the other lower forms, so-called lower forms, ought to be, what their destiny ought to be. So I will stop here and wait for the questions.
Thank you, Aditya. That was great. And you know, there's a lot at stake in this conversation, and there are big concepts, big ideas, and so on. And thank you for being so succinct and precise. And welcome even to those who've joined us from as far as Pakistan, Kenya, and so on. So we have a few comments in the chat line. This is from Maseret Desta. I joined the discussion from Kenya. My question is that despite the fight against decolonization, many post-colonial countries maintain their colonized education system. And many of the textbooks, especially at college, comes from the society that colonized many countries. Now, in this time and era, a different form of awareness has emerged, and decolonizing the mind is popularity in many universities. Again, this discussion is only at university level, and not many are talking about decolonizing in terms of making education free, colonial narrative. Local knowledge building and sharing efforts lacks investment. Scholars from Africa and non-Western countries are struggling to publish their work. With this in mind, how is it possible to achieve decolonizing efforts? So that's the first. I don't know if you have any response to that, Aditya.
Well, one very brief response is actually yes. Eventually, the ultimate the ultimate ground is where we transform our education, what we teach. But that becomes meaningless unless it is accessible to everybody, right? And right now, what we have is large swaths of people who are actually outside the education system. The conflict in as things as they exist now is to bring them into the education system, is to actually devalue their own life experiences. Where the balance between the two will come is only when you produce, or we produce, our own social sciences, in the sense that I'm not saying own social sciences as if we're going to produce new disciplines. That could also happen, but basically I think what it means is we produce new theories. We produce theories which are commensurate with our experience.
Okay. I mean, in your book, you don't reject Western theory and thought. And I think this is where the subtitle...
I don't even now. I'm not doing even now. What I'm saying is exclusive
I know.
reliance on that. No, exclusive reliance on that is alienating. Doesn't actually give us.
Correct.
So what I actually want to say is that we have to put an end to this idea of apprenticeship, that we are like perpetual apprentices in the theory workshops of the West. That is, I think, over now.
Yes, thank you. Okay, so Swati asked, and I think Swati might be in India, I'm not sure. Two questions. The decolonizing framework is being utilized today by the majoritarians to demean not only the West, but also the minority cultures. How are we to reclaim the decolonizing ideas from the majoritarian hands? I suppose that's got to do with Hindutva and so on. And two, how are we to look at the internal colonization happening within societies? By internal colonization, I mean the mainstreaming of the center and the peripheries being relegated to the backside. Okay, I don't know. Do you have any responses to those two questions?
Yes. That is actually, as I said, coming from India, that is an important question to address, because that is how decolonization has been now taken up as a slogan again by the Hindu right. And I think the response to that is not to say that therefore we are gung-ho supporters of colonialism because Hindu right. That is not the response we can possibly have, because actually what we have done over the past 7-8 decades, especially after independence, when we set up our new institutions, our colleges and universities, is to act. It was like a race against time. We simply put together syllabi existing in Western institutions, and that was the education we've been giving. And that has actually led to a devaluation of a lot of traditional. Today, people actually laugh when you talk of the huge advances made in, let us say, traditional Indian mathematics, right? Now, it is accepted that in the 5th century, this guy Brahmagupta in Ujjain is writing Siddhant, in which he, the first time the concept of zero and the decimal system and all that were invented. What the world got as Arab mathematics or Arab numerals, the 10-point decimal, all that were actually what, with a great disingenuity, our guys claim to be Vedic mathematics. This got nothing to do with Vedic, but this is a mathematics which was actually developed by Hindu intellectuals, mathematicians. The Aryabhat, great figure in the astronomy and so on. Medical, the Charak and the Sushruta Samhita are actually the important medical treatises on based on which a lot of Ayurveda continues today. Now, it has become almost to the point of a joke for secularists to talk of scientific temper in a way which rejects everything that is traditional. And I think this is not going to help. This doesn't help. The second point, very quickly, that when I'm talking of decolonizing, my point precisely is that Hindutva's knowledge of Hinduism is a colonially constructed knowledge. It is a knowledge which was produced in the 19th century, between the 18th, 19th centuries. And that knowledge was is what is now sought to be presented to us as decolonial or as decolonizing.
Thanks for that. So Roshila Naya asks, how can decolonization of theory impact the transformation, craft, economy, etc. eventually? I'm especially interested in impact on ethnic racism, religious discrimination, narrow nationalism, etc. That's a good question too.
The first is easier answered, which is that a lot of what we have by way of statecraft, by way of the various knowledges that go into the formation of the modern state, including law and so on, all these are actually produced within the European context, in the modern European context. And these need to be understood as not simply as knowledges which were describing a particular reality. These are knowledges which actually put the modern state and its statecraft and the modern law, etc. in place. In a sense, the work of people like Timothy Mitchell or others in the case of Egypt, for example, or his later work, show precisely this, how the discipline of economics is actually putting a particular kind of economy in place. It is not that the economics discipline comes first as a description of or an understanding explaining what has happened. It is simultaneously performing the task of putting that economy in place. Now, this is the kind of thing. When your knowledges change, they imply a certain transformation. That way, the function of the way knowledge functions is itself performative. It transforms. The question of ethnicities, narrow nationalisms, and so on is a slightly more difficult question, because that is where longer-term questions of ways of thinking, ideology, consciousness, whatever you want to call it, all those things actually have a much longer life. Those are not things which go away simply by the transformation of the material conditions or the knowledges that produce them in the first place. In the Indian context, we actually often say that if the British had not taken religion as the criterion of classification in the censuses, we might have been not fighting about religion. So the first, it is these knowledges which are part of colonial governmental technologies, so to speak, to the Golian term. But it is these that actually produce certain kinds of subjectivities. And that is not a simple thing to, it's not easy to get over that. That I have no answer. I mean, it'll happen, but I'm not sure it happens that easily.
Thanks, Aditya. So Dr. Betty Govenden asks, how can we see critical discussions in decoloniality and in posthumanism as entangled? I think that's interesting too. Yeah.
Posthumanism as in currently posthumanism is being posthumanism is being used in the AI context and the kind of is that the question, or there was an
Dr. Betty Govenden, do you want to speak? We can give you a chance to speak. Do you want to clarify how you're using posthumanism? Hello? Dr. Govenden?
Yeah. You have to unmute yourself.
Yeah.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Hello. Yes,
Yes.
The range of work in posthumanism is quite vast, but it should work in tandem, I would like to suggest, with the decolonial project. And it's quite ironic that these discussions are taking place in separate compartments, as it were, and there are different emphases. And how could we bring about more conversation between these two nodes of critical thinking?
Yeah,
especially with the decolonial project in mind.
No, my question to you was actually to clarify what. See, there was a moment when posthumanism was an earlier moment of where posthumanism actually referred to the death of man, so to speak, right? The death of man in the context of what Foucault says at the end of his Order of Things, the Althusserian attack on the idea of man, and so on, or idea of humanism, and the whole critique of humanism. That was one kind of posthumanism. What I see now currently is being talked about as the Vidya, like in the context of artificial intelligence, that the human now, in a way, is passé in that sense. It's not to do with the earlier moment of posthumanism. So, which is the sense in which you are talking about? I'm not
sure. In the sense of the critique of the received humanisms, the Enlightenment humanisms, and the way in which post-colonial and anti-colonial thinkers, feminist thinkers, have critiqued this version of humanism, which for me is...
On that I completely agree with you. On that I completely agree. I am a little suspicious of this later use of humanism, post-humanism, but I completely agree with you on the on the other.
And I think that it's important to have the wide expanse of what post-humanism is directing us to, but we shouldn't, in some ways, neglect or underplay the decolonial thrust and impetus in that.
Right.
Okay, I think that's agree. I mean, you know, some of post-humanists, one of the currents within that is also about challenging anthropocentrism.
Exactly.
A particular concept of the ecological.
Yes.
Okay.
That's
I think we're on the same ground here.
Yes.
Yeah, that's at the center of it in a sense. The anthropocentric understanding is at the center of the critique of humanism.
Okay, so just a throwaway comment from Jennifer, something about the gene of colonialism. We've got to free ourselves, and she thanks us. Are there any final comments before we wrap up? Contributions from anybody? We happily give you a chance to ask. Well, if there isn't, well, this has been very, very stimulating. I mean, one of the reasons I invited Aditya was because the whole decolonial kind of thrust, intellectual thrust, largely sometimes gets equated to what's coming out of Latin America. And whether it's Anibal Quijano and Mignolo and so on and so on. And what strikes me about the work that Aditya is busy with and others is that they're really kind of situating it in the Indian context. This is decolonization with an Indian flavor, if you like, and it's really kind of in that matrix that it's emerging, and I think that stands out in the context of decolonial debates, thinking, and so on. And of course, it's a lineage. I mean, Aditya knows in his book, he makes the point that even the anti-colonial movement threw up one version of decolonial nationalism with its problems. And there have been other critical thinkers in India in the 70s, Ashish Nandi, and later the subaltern studies, Partha Chatterjee. And I think in terms of his own contribution and others, this is very, very valuable and very important. So thank you, Aditya. I mean, there's a lot at stake in these conversations. I mean, how do we understand knowledge? You know, is knowledge just something that has to be partitioned? But yet, when we look at history, we realize the interconnections between societies. And you've made that point very, very, very strongly. And you've disrupted this Eurocentric conception of modernity in that way. I mean, what is modernity is a big question. And again, you started provoking us to kind of grapple with that. In your book, you look at its attempts to disaggregate it, sort of positions that stake out multiple modernities and so on. And you really take us beyond that, which I think is very, very important. I mean, you use a language also that is informed by the Indian context, and you are trying to do decolonial theory. I mean, the idea of the paramodern in your book and all of that. I mean, I think there's a whole lot of richness here that has to be developed and thought with, if you like. But in the end, I think your intellectual itinerary, your journey has been amazing. And just as a friend, it's been interesting where you've come to. In the Democratic Marxism series that I edited, we're also trying to reach for a non-Eurocentric Marxism. Lots of knots and lots of contradictions and lots of challenges on that journey. But in many ways, we're on a similar trajectory. Once again, big thank you for your time and for being here with us. And hopefully, post-COVID, we'll be able to bring you to South Africa to continue this conversation. And thank you to everybody for participating. And thank you to Jane Cherry for organizing us. Goodbye and stay safe, everybody. We will put the recording out as well. Bye, Aditya.
Bye.